Bonjour à tous. Bozu. Good morning, everyone. Merci à tous de votre présence et bienvenue à la 10e conférence du Pacifique insulaire pour la conservation de la nature et des aires protégées, organisée par le Programme régional océanien pour l'environnement, la Table ronde des îles du Pacifique et la Nouvelle-Calédonie en tant que pays hôte. À présent, nous allons écouter le pasteur Éric Wayaridri qui va prier pour nous. Merci.
Bonjour. Avant tout, je voudrais m'humilier et je voudrais remercier aussi le Seigneur pour cette opportunité. Remercier aussi le gouvernement qui est organisatrice de cette conférence. Et je remercie encore votre présence, chacune. Donc avant de prier, je voudrais lire 2 petits versets pour savoir que c'est vrai que c'est Dieu qui est à l'origine de tout. Dans Genèse chapitre 1, le verset 1, au commencement, Dieu créa les cieux et la terre. Donc, ce qu'on peut apprendre dedans, c'est que la Bible il contient 66 livres. Et donc, dans le premier livre, le premier chapitre, le premier verset et les premières paroles, il dit au commencement, Dieu. Donc, c'est important de mettre Dieu en premier dans chaque événement, dans chaque situation, avant de faire quoi que ce soit. On met Dieu en premier. Et le deuxième aussi, c'est nous devons connaître que c'est Dieu qui a créé les cieux et la terre. C'est Dieu qui est à l'origine de tout. Et le deuxième verset que je voudrais partager aussi, c'est dans Proverbes chapitre 3, et le verset 5 et 6. Il dit « Confie-toi en l'Éternel de tout ton cœur et ne t'appuie pas sur ta sagesse. Reconnais-le dans toutes tes voies et il aplanira tes sentiers. » On va prier ensemble. Seigneur notre Dieu, notre Père, c'est avec beaucoup de crainte et beaucoup d'humilité. Je voudrais vous remercier encore pour cet instant. Merci encore pour cette conférence. Nous mettons entre tes mains que tu puisses conduire, diriger toutes les discussions qui vont se faire. Merci parce que c'est vrai que tu es à l'origine de tout. Tu connais toutes choses et tu vois toutes choses. Tu connais nos cœurs, tu connais nos pensées. Je prie que tu puisses bénir, Seigneur mon Dieu, ces instants, pour ces discussions, pour ces projets. Nous mettons entre tes mains. Parce que c'est vrai que nous parlons de l'environnement, de la protection de la nature, des aires protégées. Et c'est vrai que tu es au-dessus de tout. Tu connais toutes choses. Merci pour toutes choses. Nous mettons entre tes mains et nous prions que tu puisses donner la paix, la sérénité dans les discussions, que nos projets soient entre tes mains, que tu puisses conduire et diriger toutes choses. Nous te louons, te prions au nom de Jésus-Christ, notre Sauveur, notre Seigneur. Amen. Merci.
Je vous remercie, pasteur Wayaridri. À présent, nous avons l'honneur d'avoir Monsieur le Président de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, Thierry Santa, qui va officiellement ouvrir cette 10e conférence pour la conservation de la nature et des aires protégées.
Mes chers amis du Pacifique, si loin, si proche, c'est avec beaucoup d'émotion que je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui. Mes premiers mots iront aux 9 pays amis qui ont déjà eu la chance d'accueillir, avant la Nouvelle-Calédonie, la conférence du Pacifique insulaire pour la conservation de la nature et les aires protégées. Je pense notamment à la Nouvelle-Zélande, qui a tracé la première le sillon de cette conférence. C'était il y a 45 ans déjà. Je pense aussi aux 2 dernières éditions intenses et fertiles qui ont été remarquablement organisées par la Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée en 2007 et par Fidji en 2013. Aujourd'hui, je souhaite plus que tout que les peuples du bout du monde continuent de se donner la main pour maintenir l'homme et la nature au centre de tous les débats, de tous les combats. C'est pour cela que je suis fier que la Nouvelle-Calédonie soit le pays hôte de cette 10e édition originale. Originale sur le fond comme sur la forme. À nos portes, La pandémie du Covid-19 a imposé le format virtuel de cette conférence, qui a déjà regroupé près de 1000 inscrits. Un record. Face à un monde qui évolue décidément très vite, parfois trop vite, je vous invite à réfléchir sur le thème qui nous rassemble aujourd'hui. Agir pour la nature et la résilience du Pacifique. Parlons, échangeons, partageons, pour ne pas oublier d'où nous venons et ce que nous voulons laisser à nos enfants. Pour la première fois, tous les ministres de l'environnement de la région seront réunis lors d'un segment de haut niveau qui aboutira à l'adoption de la déclaration de Vimereux. C'est une déclaration qui, dans les négociations internationales, et notamment à la COP15 prévue en Chine en 2021, portera la voix unie du Pacifique, notre voix. En langue cougnier de l'île des Pins, Vimereux renvoie au fait de rendre viable un mot, un projet. L'engagement de chacun, sa responsabilité de mettre en œuvre des principes de vie, de construire des alliances, de respecter la parole entre les hommes, entre les esprits et notre environnement. L'équilibre fragile entre la terre, l'eau, l'air, le feu, ce nom est également proche de la notion de résilience, thème central de la conférence, ne l'oublions pas. Comme vous le savez, la Nouvelle-Calédonie, en particulier ses provinces compétentes, est très investie à travers plusieurs stratégies locales pour la conservation. Au point que quelques objectifs d'Aichi sont en passe d'être atteints. Je pense notamment aux objectifs relatifs à la limitation des pêches, des pressions anthropiques exercées sur les écosystèmes vulnérables, marins, côtiers, affectés par les changements climatiques et l'acidification des océans. Les menaces qui pèsent sur l'environnement sont immenses. Il faut aller encore plus loin pour nos générations futures. Ici, en Océanie, nos îles abritent des taux d'endémisme extraordinaires, des espèces uniques, des savoir-faire locaux millénaires, notre patrimoine. Il est essentiel de créer des synergies entre les et avec les peuples du Pacifique, de renforcer la coopération, intensifier nos échanges afin de pouvoir ensemble, avec nos populations nécessairement impliquées, affronter les mutations en cours et construire une résilience commune. Je me réjouis que la dynamique soit déjà engagée. Je sais que la France et l'Europe sont là pour soutenir les réponses concrètes que nous développons, comme les projets Protège et Kiwa. D'ici à la 11e édition, nous devons pouvoir constater des améliorations notables dans tous les domaines de la conservation de la nature. Tel est mon souhait. Enfin, permettez-moi de remercier ceux sans qui cette conférence n'aurait pas été possible. Et en particulier les équipes du PROE, de la Table ronde des îles du Pacifique, de l'EICN, de l'Office français de la biodiversité, du gouvernement de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, ainsi que le Fonds Pacifique, l'AFD et tous les sponsors de l'événement, et bien sûr, tous les participants. Je déclare la 10e conférence du Pacifique insulaire pour la conservation de la nature et les aires protégées ouverte. Je vous remercie.
Nous allons à présent écouter les mots d'ouverture de Mason Smith, de la Table ronde des îles du Pacifique, président de la Table ronde des îles du Pacifique, et les mots de bienvenue de M. Kossi Latou, directeur général du PROE. Merci.
On the mark, please.
Testing.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, delegates, partners who are joining us from the Pacific region and around the world. Talofa, good afternoon and good morning wherever you're joining us from. And, thank you for joining us this afternoon. On behalf of the conference organizers, the Government of New Caledonia, the Pacific Islands Roundtable for Nature Conservation and SPREP, I would like to welcome you all to the 10th Pacific Islands Conference on Nature Conservation and Protected Areas. Firstly, I would like to thank and acknowledge the Government of New Caledonia. Through you, Your Excellency, the President of New Caledonia, President Thierry Santa. Thank you very much for graciously hosting this conference, which was originally scheduled to be held as a live event in April this year. However, due to the global pandemic, COVID-19, the event was postponed in March. We're now a virtual conference. The organizers have had to redesign the conference, which has taken over a year of planning, into a new format and delivery platform. And of course, exploring and trying innovative virtual technology to be able to still deliver a conference in 2020. We acknowledge the Government of New Caledonia for their role in our partnership, which has shown tremendous support and commitment to making this event a success. This conference would also have not been possible without the great partnerships from Pacific Islands Roundtable for Nature Conservation members that has been established for more than 20 years. I would also like to acknowledge all of our sponsors and donors who have also been critical in making this conference a success. We thank you very much for continuing to be engaged and supportive after the conference was postponed early this year. You would have heard from the President about the importance of this conference, and you've heard about the first conference that was hosted by New Zealand, and in recent years, most recently Fiji in 2013, and before that, Papua New Guinea. The conference is held every 5 to 6 years, which involves everyone that is involved in protecting and sustainably managing our Pacific biodiversity. This conference unites all key stakeholders, academics, practitioners, policymakers, government officials, NGOs, community people. And that is one of the benefit of this conference is that it brings everybody together. The instrument that we use to do this is the Pacific Islands Framework for Nature Conservation and Protected Areas. At our last very successful conference in Fiji in 2013, 800 people participated in the development of the current framework, as well as the large number of events that we held. This year, the virtual conference has brought together more than 1,500 people and more than 150 speakers, not only from the Pacific, but across the globe. This is probably the largest virtual event for our Pacific Islands region this year. The conference also aims to inspire our youth in the Pacific to engage in decision-making processes. We are very happy to see a youth session and an exhibition booth, which will help enhance the participation and explore mechanisms and strategies that will help advance youth participation in decision-making processes around nature conservation in the region. We, of course, will strive to deliver the conference as smoothly as possible. As you've seen, we've had a few technical hitches this morning, but I can say that apart from that, I'm confident that we'll be able to deliver a successful conference for you all. I would like to also thank all of the local hubs who have participated in this conference. I would like to acknowledge and thank, of course, the Pacific Community SPC in New Caledonia for hosting the local hub in New Caledonia, for welcoming our participants to join from their headquarters. I would also like to acknowledge the University of Papua New Guinea for also hosting a local hub in PNG. And of course, our colleagues and friends who are joining us from Suva, Fiji, through the IUCN Oceania Regional Office. So thank you very much to all of those who have hosted or are hosting local hubs. The second Pacific Islands Environmental Leadership Award is a key and important component or element of the conference. And it aims to celebrate the contribution of individuals, communities, and organizations, and of course our youth who have achieved tremendous achievements in terms of environmental sustainability and resilience in the Pacific. Unfortunately, because of the current events that are facing us, we have had to postpone the Environment Leadership Awards until such time in 2021, where we hope to be able to bring the 13 awardees physically to a live event to celebrate their achievements. Although global COVID-19 has made many of us reconsider our relationship with nature and the environment, it has highlighted the importance of our interrelationship with nature and the environment. For many countries, the links between environmental and human health are closely tied to key economic sectors, such as tourism, much of which in the region is supported by the combined values of our Pacific biodiversity and our cultures. In recognition of this, the Pacific Islands Framework for Nature Conservation and Protected Areas 2021-2025 is the principal regional strategy document for environmental conservation in the Pacific. It identifies the key regional priorities for action that are needed to make progress towards the 30-year vision, mission, and goals for conservation that were adopted by our Pacific leaders in 2002. It reflects the urgent need for coordinated action across the Pacific region to address both contemporary environmental crises, such as the one that we are facing right now, and the emerging threats to Pacific environments, communities, and economies. Recognizing the importance of alignment with other multilateral instruments and agreements, the strategic objectives of the framework are linked to key global environment and development frameworks. The State of Environment and Conservation in the Pacific Islands 2020 Regional Report provides regional indicators that lay the groundwork for sustained monitoring of our actions and measures our success and shortfalls in achieving sustainable development in the Pacific. This is the first combined regional assessment of the state of environment and conservation, and it has important messages to help guide the action of countries, regional organizations, and development partners. My colleague, Mr. Stuart Shape, the director of the Island and Ocean Ecosystems Program, will be shortly presenting the key findings of the state of conservation in his presentation, which is aimed at setting the scene for this conference. To conclude, I would like to thank all our partners, our member countries, our sponsors, and all of those who have joined us for this very important conference, for coming together and showing an enormous level of passion and enthusiasm for this conference. And it is our hope that this 10th Pacific Islands Conference on Nature Conservation and Protected Areas will achieve what we hope to do during this week. The outcomes of this conference will take the voices of the Pacific, as you heard from the president of New Caledonia, to international forums as part of the Blue Pacific contribution to urgent actions for nature conservation and for building back a better planet for the future generations. Thank you, Faftai. And I would now like to call on Mr. Stuart Shea to make his presentation on the framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kossi, and greetings everyone, wherever you may be around the region and indeed around the world. The purpose of this presentation is to provide a summary of the key findings of the state of conservation in Oceania, in the conservation of the Pacific Islands, as an input to this conference. Next slide, please, Amanda. Firstly, some background. This time we have produced a combined state of environment and conservation in the Pacific Islands as a regional report, using environmental indicators that were endorsed by SPREP member countries and territories in 2018. The State of Conservation component updates the State of Conservation in Oceania report, which was presented to the 9th Pacific Islands Nature Conservation Conference held in Fiji in 2013. Data for the assessment was obtained through public data portals, publications, and direct requests to countries and partners. Inevitably, perhaps the quality, quantity, and reliability of data varied due to a number of factors. And for example, lack of up-to-date research, comparability between methodologies used for assessments, or metadata limitations. The review period is 2012 to 2020, overlapping the previous assessment, but some of the data inevitably has gone back further than that and is not absolutely current. The findings, as I said, will be a contribution to this 10th conference, as well as ongoing monitoring of the status of conservation and biodiversity, conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems in the region. Next slide, please. The approach to the assessment is a little bit simpler than it was last year. Each regional indicator is Each regional indicator is assessed on the basis of the present status and trends, including data availability, pressures relating to the dominant factors and drivers of socio-environmental change, and there are a set of response recommendations at the end of each indicator assessment in the report. Next. There are 7 broad assessment categories in the report: environmental governance, land, coastal and marine, conservation and protection, biodiversity, atmosphere and climate, and the built environment. Thanks. Next. You will find in the report a dashboard of symbols which are used to simplify the presentation of the assessment for each indicator. So the color indicates good, fair, poor, or unknown, or can be a combination of these assessments. You will then see an arrow or a symbol which indicates whether the trend is improving, stable, deteriorating, mixed, or unknown. And at the bottom of the status symbol, you see an indication of the confidence in the data, low, medium, or high. Next. This is a 156-page report, and although one can say that every element within it relates to the agenda for this conference, conservation and protected areas, I'm only going to focus on those that are directly relatable to those topics. So next, biodiversity. Next, native forest cover. Next, wetlands, live coral cover. Conservation and protection. Environment Ministry budget allocation under governance and funding for ecosystem-based adaptation. Next. Okay, and I have grouped these into broad categories of species, ecosystem, habitat, and response. Next. Firstly, the IUCN Red List summary as an indication of status of species in the region. The status has been rated as fair, but the trend is deteriorating, and we have medium confidence in the data. Populations of 47% of known threatened Pacific species are declining, and only 1% of listed species have an increasing trend in population abundance. And of course, species in the region, species in the region are impacted by invasive species, habitat loss, pollution, bycatch, and predation, including unsustainable harvesting. Next. Since the last assessment, assessment of conservation in the region, the IUCN Red List assessment has now almost doubled the number of listed species. Previously, it was just under 6,000 when we did the 2013 report. And for this report, the data provided is on almost 12,000 species. Of this, almost 1,900 species are listed, or 16.9% are listed as threatened, falling into the categories of critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. Although this level is lower than the 23% in the 2013 report, with the much larger number of total species, this has been probably responsible for the lower rating, the lower level of threatened species. It doesn't mean that I don't think it's got particularly better. There are 125 species that are considered extinct or extinct in the wild. And almost 1,500 species are data deficient, so we don't know where they stand. Next. This is an interesting graph because it shows the percentage of threatened species by country and territory. And you can see that every country and territory has a share of the number of threatened species in the region. Unfortunately, New Caledonia is at the top with 20% of the total threatened species in the region. I'm assuming because of the great endemicity in the island and its large size and large number of species. Next. Migratory species are a very important part of this region. And so we have assessed an indicator on the status of migratory species of concern, and the status is poor to fair. The trend is deteriorating, and the data confidence is medium. Population sizes are decreasing for 51% of conventional migratory species, listed species present in the Pacific. and 31% have stable or increasing populations. 58% of marine migratory species are at risk with declining populations. The population status of humpback whales, loggerhead and leatherback turtles are unfortunately worse in the Pacific than elsewhere in the species range, although humpback whales are certainly on the road to recovering. Next. Okay, moving to ecosystems, habitats. Next. Firstly, native forest cover, which has been assessed as fair to good with mixed trends, and the data is confidence is medium. This is really a mixed assessment, rather than when the results are mixed for a number of reasons. Only 16% of forest and Oceania are in protected areas. And of course, the loss of native forest results in loss of biodiversity and the ecological services provided by forests and watersheds, including food security and climate change resilience. Next. In this map, which shows the forest cover change from 2000 to 2015, so it's not up to date, but it was the best available that we could use for this, showing changes in total forest cover. And you can see that the reason why the trend is mixed in the region. For many of the countries, the smaller countries, there has been, in terms of total forest cover, a relative increase in cover, and some with no significant change. Decreases in forest cover have occurred in American Samoa and Northern Mariana Islands, and in Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. Next. A more recent assessment been undertaken by, the previous data was from FAO, a more recent assessment was undertaken by Global Forest Watch. And this is the data for loss of primary forest cover, that is forest with a canopy greater than 75% cover in 7 countries. And the data runs from 2000 to 2010 or up to 2018. It also shows the CO2 emissions associated with the loss of this forest cover. So the table runs in reverse order from Vanuatu to the Solomon Islands. And as you can see, particularly in terms of the percentage of area of country, Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands have high percentages of loss of primary forest cover. And it's only a few countries, it is the few countries, and of course, the major countries that are large size with extensive forest, that have driven the loss of over 40% of the region's primary forest since 1990. Primary lowland and coastal forests has disappeared in many of the smaller countries. Next. Turning to wetlands, the status is fair, the trend deteriorating, but the data confidence is low. We don't have a lot of data across the region to be able to definitive or higher level of confidence in wetland status of wetlands. The records across the region are patchy, leading to this low data confidence ranking. We do know, however, that they face significant threats, especially from land use change, climate change, and other impacts. Next, thanks. Live coral cover. The regional average, again, the status for this is poor to fair, the trend deteriorating. and the data confidence is low. The regional average for coral cover was ranked in the status and trends of coral reefs in the Pacific report in 2018 as 26%, but this was based only on data from 75 sites. Still relatively high live coral cover. We still have relatively high coral cover compared to an estimated historical baseline, which is given the status for being fair. However, as we know, coral reefs are under increasing pressure from human activities and climate change, and the trend is there for the reefs. Coral reefs is therefore deteriorating. Next. Okay, moving on to responses. Next. Firstly, invasive species. Managing and eradicating invasive species is a fundamental issue for the region because of its high impact on biodiversity, on human health, and economic development. The status for invasive species under management is poor to fair. The trend is mixed. We do actually have a high confidence level in the data because of the extensive work that has been going on in the region. About 50% of countries and territories have a specific national invasive species strategy and action plan or its equivalent, although many of the plans only extend to this year. Regionally, there are 116 priority invasive plant species management programs, and 25 priority invasive animal programs have resulted in eradication, and rats have been eradicated from 85 islands. I'm having difficulty actually reading the last line on these slides, so okay, let me just revert to my own presentation. And the situation in some countries is deteriorating. Next, thanks. Okay, turning to terrestrial protected areas, the status unfortunately remains poor. The trend though is improving, and we have medium confidence in the data. Coverage of terrestrial protected areas is almost 32,000 square kilometres, or nearly 6% of the total land area of nearly 550,000 square kilometres across the region. In the 2013 SOCO report, the coverage was 5%, so we have increased by 1%. But as I said, the status is still poor, but with a positive trend in the designation of land area protected. Next. Marine protected areas are a different story altogether as an average across the region. Marine protected areas cover almost 6,000 square kilometres, or approximately 20% of combined Pacific EEZs. In 2013, the total MPA coverage was only 2%, and that was largely as a result of the declaration of the Phoenix Islands protected area by Kiribati. There were other large MPAs in the pipeline, but they weren't established at the time that the report was presented. Next. Now this graph shows both marine and terrestrial areas. And looking at this, you can actually see where the gaps are and where the progress has been. So in the case of marine protected areas, even though there is a very large percentage across the region as a whole, you can see that this has been achieved by 7 countries and territories through their establishment of MPAs, and therefore exceeding Aichi target 11 of 10% for MPA establishment. There are many of the other countries which have yet to make any progress on establishing of marine protected areas. 7 countries and territories have exceeded Aichi target 11 of 17% for terrestrial coverage. And again, except for New Caledonia, these countries and territories have small land areas. But where the rubber hits the road is in terms of how these protected areas are effective in conserving biodiversity. 6 terrestrial ecoregions have more than 17% of their area within protected areas, while 7 have less than 1%. 13 marine ecoregions only have 10% or more of the area within MPAs, and less than 25% of key biodiversity areas and 27% of important bird areas are within protected areas in the region. So that's why it's going to be extremely important as we go forward that this graph is balanced out across the countries, across the region, to address this critical issue. Less than 4% of MPAs and 1% of terrestrial protected areas have undergone protected area management effectiveness assessments, but in most cases, perhaps not surprising given the recent declaration of these areas. Next, thanks. So in terms of marine protected areas, there is, of course, a lot going on, and a number of countries are proceeding with major marine spatial planning and preparation and declaration of national ocean policies to drive forward the ocean agenda within their countries. So we know, for example, also that Fiji has recently declared its intention to have 30% of its ocean under protection. Next. We also know that marine protected areas can work, and here an example from the Phoenix Islands protected area in Kiribati, and the difference between 1 year of not having a no-take zone declared in the Phoenix Islands protected area in 2014 to that which was declared in 1 year after it was declared in 2015. And in terms of being respected by fishing operations within the area. However, of course, small countries can't monitor such areas all the time, and that's why it's going to be important for them to partner with outside expertise and technology which will allow them to do this. Next. It's going to be critically important that we address the impacts of marine pollution, which is a growing issue within the region. And while countries have introduced waste-reducing policies and legislation to curb the import, production and uncontrolled release of waste, like introducing levies on polluting materials, such as single-use plastics, and also the SPREP and its partners and members have prepared and endorsed the Pacific Regional Waste and Pollution Management Strategy and Regional Marine Litter Action Plan, which is being implemented by SPREP and its partners. The issue is enormous, and considering that most of the marine litter that enters the region, it comes from outside sources from the region. And this is an ongoing issue that must be addressed. Next. Okay, turning to the specific indicator of environmental governance and environment budget allocation, the status has been assessed to be poor to fair and the trend mixed, and we have medium confidence in the data. Unfortunately, expenditure on environmental management in 2019 formed only 1.3% of government budgets as an average across 11 of 21 countries and territories. However, having said that, there are within the region innovative approaches to finance, such as the Micronesia Conservation Trust, the Palau Green Fee, and the Republic of Marshall Islands Blue Fee, which other countries should consider emulating. And increased expenditure on environment within countries at the governance level is completely justified. And thanks. Sorry, I think we've got a. Can you go back, please? There's been a jump here. Okay. No, there's not. Sorry. Keep going. So turning to the indicator for funding for ecosystem-based adaptation, which was actually a recommendation which came out of the last conference, was to increase our funding for this. We now have approximately $100 million in recently completed current and planned ecosystem-based adaptation projects in the region, funded by various donors, including Australia, the European Union, France, Germany, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the United States, and others. So momentum has grown considerably in supporting this very important area to address climate change and environmental sustainability. Next. Okay, I'm sorry, the slides were, I would have to look at my own presentation, and so the slides have been changed. Sorry, keep going, I've already addressed that. So, okay, what I was going to say in relation to governance and funding, we know that environmental resources provide a huge support for economies in the country, in the region, for countries in the region. And these examples are from the McBio project resource economic assessments that were done in 2014. And as you can see, marine tourism in Fiji alone brings in revenue, and still does, brings in revenue of more than $1 billion a year. So there is certainly justification for higher levels of expenditure by governments in protecting biodiversity and managing ecosystems. Next, thanks. We also have Palau showing the way, because it's not only about the money, but also about establishing a national environmental ethos. And through its Palau Pledge and other initiatives, Palau has shown us that we can establish and formalize such an ethos. Next. Okay, final thoughts on the assessment and where we go from here. Next. What we're addressing this week in terms of conservation and protected areas in relation to the framework for nature conservation and protected areas for the region, the one that you will be considering this week, sits within a wider framework within the region of a number of other frameworks. And here in this diagram, I have placed it center. Other sectors would place it differently perhaps, but it is a critical component of the Pacific leaders' Blue Pacific Construct, which includes implementation of the framework for a Pacific Oceanscape, which was adopted in 2010, the framework for resilient development in the Pacific, the framework for a cleaner Pacific, and the regional roadmap for sustainable Pacific fisheries. There are others, but these are critical frameworks which will need to be integrated in their implementation. And of course, the nature conservation protected areas component of that is absolutely critical. Next. At the global level, because the Pacific countries and territories obviously participate in what is happening at a global level in terms of biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable development, we must support the integration of what will be the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework with the SDGs and the Samoa pathway. Next. But all of these are highly dependent on implementation of the Paris Agreement to address the issues of climate change that are affecting the region and the world. And the effectiveness of all these other factors is highly dependent on this. Next. Okay, some last points. Next 5 years and beyond, we need to address critical issues, and some of these are here. We need to adopt and implement a coherent and achievable regional framework for nature conservation and protected areas. It needs to be able to work, to be implemented. We also need to contribute to a coherent and achievable post-2020 global biodiversity framework that works for the region. We need to strengthen ecosystem management regimes and relationships and partnerships with customary resource owners as an absolutely critical aspect of conservation in the region, and certainly for establishment of terrestrial conservation mechanisms. We need to expand ocean and terrestrial conservation management in all countries and territories to ensure comprehensive coverage of ecoregions, KBAs, IBAs, and ecologically and biologically sensitive areas in the marine domain. We need to protect biodiversity and ecosystem services that can sustainably support livelihoods and food security. Providing the level of resources needed for effective ecosystem and species management and to deal with threats, especially invasive species, is also fundamental and critical. We need to continue implementing ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change impacts and other nature-based solutions that sustain ecological services. We also need to implement a precautionary approach to deep sea mining. We need to ensure that this new frontier of science and knowledge and biodiversity for sustainable benefits does not become yet another frontier of exploitation and environmental degradation. So I'm sure there are others, and you'll be talking about these issues this week, but that in a nutshell is the summary of the current report, and you can provide any feedback and comments on the platform provided through this meeting. Thank you.
Merci Stuart pour cette présentation. Nous allons à présent écouter Monsieur Mason Smith, directeur président de la Table ronde des îles du Pacifique. Merci.
Thank you, Bettina. Thank you, Bettina, and thank you, Stuart, for that short summary of the SOCO report. Excellencies, honorable ministers, PIRT members, registered participants, ladies and gentlemen. Lisa Ngulumnaka and greetings from Suva, Fiji, to each and every one of you. First of all, I must apologize for the IT glitch that happened about an hour ago. That is now fixed. So this morning, I have much pleasure to welcome you as chair of PIRT, the Pacific Island Roundtable for Nature Conservation and Protected Areas. First, let me echo the sentiments of my colleague, the Director General of SPREP, Mr. Kosilatu, to thank the President of New Caledonia, His Excellency Thierry Santa, for his statement this morning. And I also wish to acknowledge New Caledonia as the host country for this 10th Nature Conference. Although we may not be physically present in Noumea, you can be rest assured that we will be there with you in the Pacific spirit. Allow me to also extend my appreciation to our colleagues at the Tijubu Cultural Center, and I must say that we continue to look forward to the day where we can gather in your magnificent cultural center for another nature conference. Dear participants, today we make a milestone of sorts, and I would like to thank the 10th Nature Conference co-planning team for their dedication and effort over the past few months as we planned and prepared for this conference. As you know, we visited Noumea in February this year, but alas, the region and indeed the world was confronted by the current COVID-19 pandemic, and we had to change the scope and delivery model for this conference from the traditional face-to-face conference to this one, a hybrid of virtual interactions and face-to-face meetings. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the new norm and new challenges. But in having said that, I just wish to thank Director General Kosi, Stewart, Amanda, Junie, Wota, James, Bettina, and Margaret, and also our team at Verizon. Thank you all for this wonderful journey of preparing for this conference. Allow me now to welcome our PIRT members and the 1,300 registered participants, plus those physically present at the 4 face-to-face hubs. A special shout out to our colleagues at the University of Papua New Guinea. Morning to Wantoks. Bonjour to our colleagues in Noumea and SPC. Talofa to our colleagues at SPREP and in Apia. And Bulvinaka to those of you at the 3 venues of the Fiji IUCN and National Trust of Fiji hubs. Colleagues, a conference of this magnitude would not be possible if it were not for the support of our sponsors. And as mentioned by the Director General and others that have spoken, I would like to acknowledge the financial and in-kind contribution of our sponsors and supporters this morning. Thank you too much, Binaka Vakalevu, for all your support. Colleagues, 45 years ago, the first Nature Conference was hosted by New Zealand. Since then, the region has continued to face many challenges. We know and we understand the present threat posed by climate change, but more importantly, our desire to build the resilience of our Pacific people. Whether it is warming oceans temperatures, increasing ocean acidification, the inundation of our coastal zones, threats to food security, the loss of biodiversity, or ecosystem degradation. The fact is, we must act now. The theme of our 10th Nature Conference is therefore Nature Conservation Action for a Resilient Pacific, the operative word being action. Post-conference, we must hold ourselves accountable and take action where necessary. Let us help ourselves first before we ask others to help us. Let us be resilient. During the course of the next few days, we aim to achieve the following conference objectives. As mentioned by my colleague from SPREP, one of which is the awards for the environment, which will come down in 2021. The second is the launch of the 2020 regional report on the state of environment and conservation in the Pacific Island, of which Stewart has just provided us a very good summary. This, as you know, is the first combined regional assessment of the state of environment and conservation. But more importantly, it should guide the actions of countries, regional organizations, and development partners. You can provide us with your comments on the report as mentioned by Stewart. Thirdly, the new framework for nature conservation and protected areas will be presented to participants. After months of extensive consultations with over 23 Pacific Island government agency staff, 9 PIRT member organizations, 8 civil society organizations, both national and regional, plus over 28 individual interviews with regional conservation experts, we have arrived at the framework that should guide our work in the coming years. I encourage you to read and act upon the framework. Colleagues, on Thursday, the Wilmaru Declaration and Call to Action will be presented. And it is the intention of PIRT that this declaration will also be echoed at the international level. At the upcoming IUCN Congress in Marseille, France in 2021, and at the CBD COP, amongst others. Last but not the least, we intend to provide PIRT members with a post-conference action strategy to ensure that we remain engaged with you all on the framework and PIRT matters more generally. Allow me to close by saying that we have an exciting few days ahead of us. There are virtual exhibition booths, networking lounges, 3 thematic sessions, and 21 action sessions. We have a dedicated youth session, a high-level segment, and some amazing stories to tell. I urge you all to remain actively engaged and to participate in as many sessions as you can. I hope to meet some of you virtually over the next few days, and I wish each and every one of you all the best, and I hope we will be able to achieve the objectives of this conference. Thank you, and Vinaka Wakalevu.
Merci Mason. Merci à tous pour votre attention pendant cette session. Nous vous invitons désormais à continuer à participer aux différentes sessions proposées aujourd'hui et pendant les 3 jours qui vont suivre. Et donc, on vous donne rendez-vous tout de suite, dans 15 minutes, pour la suite. Restez connectés. Je vous souhaite une bonne conférence. Merci. Oleti. Chiorion. Thank you, everyone.